Hello viewers, today we will discuss about the National Biodiversity Act. So far we have seen the different biodiversity which is present in the wetlands, in the coral reefs, in the forest and other places, and now we will see what has been the act that has been passed which is important, the prohibitions, the provisions, the objectives of the act which help in maintaining and protecting the biodiversity of the ecosystems. So, the biodiversity, just giving an introduction, it encompasses the variety of all life that can be found on our planet, on the earth. And India is one of the 17 mega diverse countries of the world. It is a mega diverse country, keep that in mind. And with only 2.5% of the land area, India accounts for 7.8% of the global recorded species. So, really the diversity is high, and we have a good number of unique species which are found in our own country, and India is also rich in traditional and indigenous knowledge, both coded and informal. So, biodiversity is all the variety of the life forms that you can find on the planet Earth. It can be the flora, the fauna, different type of birds. And why do we need to conserve the biodiversity, and what are the acts that have been passed, and why is this so important for the protection of the same? So, you might have heard about the Convention on Biological Diversity. Often we refer to this as CBD. So, India is party to the Convention on the Biological Diversity passed in 1992. This recognizes the sovereign rights of states to use their own biological resources. Convention expects the parties to facilitate access to genetic resources by other parties subject to national legislation and on mutually agreed upon terms. So, this is the act that I am reading from the article 3 and 15 of the CBD. Article 8J of the Convention of the Biological Diversity, this recognizes contribution of the local and indigenous communities to the conservation and sustainable utilization of the bioresources or the biological resources, utilizing them sustainably through traditional knowledge. So, traditional knowledge is an important aspect, the practices, innovations, and this also provides for equitable sharing of the benefits with such people, that is the local indigenous communities, arising from the utilization of their knowledge, practices and innovations. So, this is the article 8J of the CBD. The Convention on Biological Diversity. So, this was negotiated and signed by the nations at the Earth Summit held at Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992 in the month of June. It came into force on December 29th, 1993, and India became party to the CBD in 1994. Presently, there are 175 parties to this convention. So, this is the CBD. It was signed at the Earth Summit. It is popularly called as the Earth Summit at Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1992. So, what were the objectives of this convention? The main objectives include the following. As we all know, the convention or the conservation of the biological diversity or biodiversity, sustainable use of the different components of biodiversity, fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of these genetic resources. So, conservation, sustainable use of the components and fair and equitable sharing and the utilization of the genetic resources. Reaffirming the sovereign rights of the parties over their own biodiversity, the convention balances the conservation with sustainable utilization and access to and use of the bioresources, associated knowledge with equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of such use. So, the acts are actually written in the legal language, and this whole module focuses on the articles, the sections, and how they have been framed for the protection of the biological resources. So, the CBD offers opportunities to India to realize benefits from its rich biological resources and associated traditional knowledge. So, the local communities in our country, they have abundant traditional knowledge. For example, the importance of the medicinal usage of a particular herb which is found in that region, or which is used for the treatment of some disease, or that can be used in some cuisine, in some traditional cooking recipes. So, the local people are often associated with traditional knowledge, and they are involved in realizing the benefits from the rich biological resources. Now, this is fundamental to the agricultural and food production. Limitless organisms are found in the natural ecosystems. In the modern agriculture, the farmers adopt high yielding varieties of plants and animals, which make biodiversity an essential contribution for feeding the millions of people globally in the world. And also, the farmers also use the unique and diverse varieties, and we should stop the varieties from actually going extinct. So, modern agricultural farming also make biodiversity a very important contribution for feeding the people in the world. And eradication of poverty. The stakeholders in the biological diversity include the central government, the state government, institutions of local self-government organization, industry, etc. One of the major challenges before India lies in adopting an instrument which helps to realize the objectives of the benefits that are enshrined in the Convention on Biological Diversity. Coming to the Biological Diversity Act 2002. So, this was an act of the Parliament of India for the preservation of the biological diversity in India, and it provides mechanism for equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the use of traditional biological resource and knowledge. This was enacted to meet the obligations under the CBD to which India is a party. So, it is an act of the Parliament for preserving the biological diversity in India. Now, what does the act aim at? So, the act aims at conserving the biological resource, the associated knowledge, facilitating access in a sustainable manner, so that these resources can be used sustainably and through a fair and just process. For the purposes of implementing the objects of the act, it established the National Biodiversity Authority, or the NBA, which is a central authority headquartered in Chennai. The biological diversity is a national asset or wealth of a country, and hence the conservation of biodiversity assumes greater significance. The first attempt to bring the biodiversity into the legal framework was made by way of the Biodiversity Bill in 2000, which was then passed by the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha in December 2002. So, this was the first attempt, and since biodiversity is a national wealth and asset of a country, this was brought into the legal framework by means of certain bills. The summary of this Biological Diversity Act, because it is not possible to tell in detail about every chapter. So, this basically has 12 chapters, there are 65 sections and many subsections, there are notified, notification and rules. Basically, the first chapter defines preliminary terminologies and definitions of the BDA. The chapter 2 deals with the regulations of access to the biological diversity. Chapter 3 deals with establishment of the National Biodiversity Authority. Chapter 4 deals with the functions and powers of the NBA. Chapter 5 deals with approval by the Biodiversity Authority (NBA) for understanding certain activities, transfer of biological resource or associated knowledge. The chapter 6 deals with establishment of SBB, or the State Biodiversity Board. Chapter 7 includes the finance, accounts and audit of the National Biodiversity Authority. Chapter 8 includes again the same. Chapter 9 are the duties of the central and the state government. Chapter 10 will include the constitution of the SBB, the State Biodiversity Management Committees. They are also called as a BMC. Chapter 11 is a local biodiversity fund, and chapter 12 is the miscellaneous. So, these are the 12 chapters which are found in BDA, that is a Biodiversity Act of 2002, and this again has 65 sections with a number of notification and rules. How do we define biodiversity? So, biodiversity has been defined under the section 2B of the Act as a variability among living organisms, or the variety of organisms that can be found in the planet, the variability among the living organisms from all sources and the ecological complexes of which they are part of, This includes diversity within species, between species and also between the different ecosystems. So, this is the exact definition of the biodiversity that has been given in the section 2B of this Act. How do we define biological resources? This is also given in the Act, which defines biological resources as plants, animals and microorganisms or parts thereof, their genetic material and byproducts, excluding the value added products with actual or potential use or value, but does not include human genetic material. So, basically as a whole under an umbrella, we can define that the biological resource include the plant resource, animal and the microorganism resource and their parts and their byproducts. The objectives of the Act include to conserve the biological diversity, the sustainable use of the components of biodiversity, fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the use of biodiversity, and the National Biodiversity Authority has been established by this Act to regulate and implement the rules which have been operationalized and that have come into force. So, these are some of the objectives of the BDA. What are the provisions of the Act? So, there is prohibition on transfer of Indian genetic material outside the country without specific approval of the Indian government, prohibition of anyone claiming an IPR such as a patent over biodiversity or related knowledge without permission of the Indian government, regulation of collection, use of biodiversity by Indian nationals, that is biological diversity by Indian nationals, while exempting the local communities from such restrictions. These are three of the provisions of the Act. Measures from sharing of benefits from use of biodiversity. This includes transfer of technology, monetary returns, joint R&D, joint IPR ownership, etc. Some measures to conserve the sustainable use of biological resources, habitat and species protection of projects, integration of biodiversity into the plans and policies of various departments and sectors. So, these are another two of the provisions of the Act. The provisions for local communities to have a say in the use of their resources and knowledge and to charge fees for this. So, this is also a provision where local community have a say in the use of the resource and knowledge. Protection of indigenous or traditional laws such as registration of such knowledge, regulation of the use of the genetically modified organisms. The setting up of national, state and local biodiversity funds to be used to support the conservation and benefit sharing, setting up of biodiversity management committees, they are referred to as the BMCs at the local village levels, State Biodiversity Board at state level and the National Biodiversity Authority at the central level. What are the exemptions provided in the Act? So, we have seen the objectives, the provisions and now there are also some exemptions that have been given in the Act. The Biological Act 2002 includes the following exemptions. They are the exemption to local people and the community of that area, of the forested area, for free access to use biological resources within India. So, the local people and the community of that area, they can freely use the biological resource within India. Exemption to growers and the cultivators of biodiversity and to Veds and Hakims to use the biological resource in their experimental processes. Exemption through notification of normally traded commodities from the purview of the Act. Exemption for collaborative research through government sponsored and government approved institutions subject to overall policy guidelines and approval of the central government. So, these are some exemptions that are also given in the Act. The management structure of the Biodiversity Act. So, this is, as we discussed, it is a three-tiered structure at the national level, at the state level and the local level. The National Biodiversity Authority, which is at the national level, the central, it is a statutory autonomous body established as or headquartered in Chennai under the Ministry of Environment and Forest, established in 2003, and it implements the provisions under the Act. All matters relating to requests for the access by foreign individuals, institutions or companies and the matters related to transfer of result of research to any foreigner will be dealt by the NBA. The functions of this authority include advise the central government on any matter concerning the conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of its components, and fair equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the use of biological resource and knowledge, coordinate the activities of the state biodiversity boards, provide technical assistance to the state biodiversity boards, sponsor investigation and research. So, this is a function of the NBA. Now, we have at the next level we find the state biodiversity boards, the SBBs. These are created in 28 states along with 31,574 BMCs, that is the Biological Management Committees. All matters relating to access by Indians for commercial purposes are listed under the SBB. The Indian industry will be required to provide prior intimation to the concerned SBB about the use of biological resource. They will have the power to restrict any such activity that violates the objectives of conservation, sustainable use and equitable sharing of benefits. They can engage the consultants for a specific period not exceeding 3 years for providing technical assistance to the authority in the effective discharges of its functions, compile, collect and publish technical statistical data, manuals, codes or guides relating to conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of its components, fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the use of biological resource and its knowledge. Organize through mass media comprehensive programs regarding the conservation of biodiversity, and again the same act which has been repeated, the sustainable use of the components and fair and equitable sharing of the benefits that arise out of the use of the biological resource and knowledge. So, they can also organize comprehensive programs relating to conservation and sustainable management of biodiversity and its components. Plan and organize the trainings of the biodiversity and its components. Prepare the annual budget of the authority, including its receipts, also the de-valuation from the central government, provided that the allocation can be operated in accordance with the budget provision which is approved by the central government. So, it can organize trainings for the personnel and prepare the annual budget of its authority. Recommend the creation of post to the central government for the discharge of the duties and the functions of the authority. Approve the method of recruitment to the officers and servants of the authority. They can also take steps to build a database and to create information and documentation system for biological resources and associated traditional knowledge through biodiversity register, electronic databases to ensure the effective management, promotion and sustainable uses of the biodiversity and its components. They can give directions to the SBBs, the Biodiversity Management Committees, for effective implementation of the Act. They can report to the central government about functioning of this authority. They can sanction grant to the SBBs and the BMCs for specific purposes. So, all this what we are covering now deals with the State Biodiversity Board and what are their functions, what they can do. They can also take necessary measures including appointment of legal experts to oppose the grant of intellectual property right in any country outside India on any biological resource and associated knowledge obtained from India and in an illegal manner. So, they can appoint the legal experts in this regard. What are the penalties? So, these were the provisions that we saw in the Act, the prohibitions also, the objectives. Now, if a person violates these acts which have been mentioned, then he will be punishable with imprisonment for a term which can extend to 5 years with fine, that can also extend to 10 lakh rupees, where the damage cost exceeds 10 lakh rupees, then the fine may commensurate with the damage cost or with both. So, this is punishable with imprisonment. Any offence under this act is non-bailable, so it cannot be bailed out and it is cognizable. So, biodiversity management communities, so the local state government will be required to set up their BMCs in the respective areas for conservation and sustainable use, and they will also the concerned SBBs and NBAs for the matters related to how to use this biological resource and the knowledge within their local jurisdiction. Biodiversity Heritage Sites, BHS, they can include the wild and domesticated biodiversity, human cultural relations and such biodiversity. They are different from the concept of protected areas covered in the Wildlife Act. So, in the Wildlife Act we have something called as protected areas. This biodiversity heritage site is different from that which is covered in the Wildlife Act. The local communities are central in identifying and deciding the potentials of the BHS. Both traditional, modern scientific knowledge can be used. Involvement of marginalized section of communities including women. So, women should be involved in the policy and decision making level also. Government institutions, NGOs and teachers should facilitate the local communities for capacity building for managing these biological heritage sites. So, this is how the local communities, the involvement of marginalized sections of the communities including women, and how all the organizations together they can help in the capacity building for managing the heritage sites of the bioreserves. Coming to a summary or the conclusion of the Act. So, the conservation of biodiversity is a serious concern, and it is a common concern for better living for the human beings and also for the species themselves. Women in the rural setup, they play a very important vital role in the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. They know the different components, how and where they can be used. The biodiversity are important components for economic, social development, poverty eradication, overriding priorities of most of the developing countries in the world. So, hence the Act, that is the National Biodiversity Act, the Biological Diversity Act of 2002, and the provisions, the authorities that have been set up, the National Biological Diversity Authority NBA, the State Biological Biodiversity Authority, and the localized authorities, the management communities and the biodiversity heritage sites. So, these are some of the aspects that we have seen today. The provisions the Act provides us with, the objectives of the Act mainly, which include to conserve the rich biological diversity and the sustainable use of these biodiversity components, each part, and what are the penalties if anybody violates this Act, what are the penalties that can be imposed upon them. Hence, the conservation of biodiversity is very important, it is vital, and it is the wealth of a country, and that is why India is also as a party to the CBD, the Convention for Biological Diversity Act. It has joined in the convention, and it has its own act for protecting and conserving the rich biodiversity of the country.